Strength training should be a part of your regular routine, whether or not you're a runner. Yes, it might give you some improvements out on the trail, but it also just helps you live a long, healthy life. We don't do a lot of strength stuff in our day to day life, so getting to the gym or doing some body weight stuff at home is an important way to keep you healthy and mobile and able to play with your grandkids on the floor someday for a really long time. I see a lot of strength programs on the internet that are fine. They do a decent job, but they're really not tailored to you, and there's good reason for that. It is hard to tailor a strength program to a person whom you've never met. So I wanted to talk about strength assessments, how I put someone through a strength or movement assessment when I first start working with them, and just show you what I do and what I look for. That way, whenever you download a strength program, you might be able to make some slight adjustments based on how you move. I'm also going to link a new strength guide or updated strength guide that I'm releasing here, and it is going to have a new program that I've created that will be for in the gym. It will also have a version of that same program for bands and body weight in case you don't have a gym membership. I just want to provide a strength program and strength system for people who can't afford to get to a trainer. So at the very least, go check the show notes, read the guide, check it out, and let's get stronger so that we can live a long, healthy life and be good out on the trails. This one is probably going to be better on video, but I try to do my best to describe the movements as I'm going through them, but unless you really know what I'm talking about, you'd be probably better to go listen to the video. So let's get into it. Let's talk about strength assessments, how I look at how people move to design a strength program, and what tweaks you might be able to make for yourself. Welcome to the Trail and Ultra Running Training Podcast. My name is Will Franz, and I'm here to help you improve your training so you can have more fun out on the trails. We are live. If you don't know who I am, my name is Will Franz. I'm a personal trainer and trail running coach, and I just want to help you improve on your trail running journey. And today's topic, I want to get into strength training stuff. If you want to get the most out of your strength training, then it should be fairly personalized or individualized. It should be a program for you. I don't think it's completely necessary. People do well on universalized programs as long as they're well written. But if you want to get the most out of it, it should fit you and your needs as a runner, as a person. It should take into account your body and movement mechanics and history and all this stuff. So today I want to run over how I do a strength assessment for people or a movement assessment for people before I do strength training with them. It looks a little different depending on the person and whether I'm in person or online. The fundamentals are the same. So I'm just going to show you exactly what I do with people. But be aware that if you ever do this with me, it might look a little different because I learn things along the way. We might dive deeper into something. So for example, you're going to see me do something like a wall test. I had one woman who had an extra rib up here, so there's no way that she could get higher than that. So we didn't dive any deeper into that because it was physically impossible to move her shoulder in that manner. So depending on where you are, we might dive deeper. We might completely skip something altogether because there's nothing you can do short of taking a rib out to make your overhead extension better. So first, why do we need an assessment? Because you might need different stuff than your running partner or your training partner or the guy down the street. For example, a lot of people who have been running for 20 years tend to have what we call knee valgus, so their knees dive in. And we'll see that in our first test, like the squat test. So if you have knee valgus, it can mean many things, which we'll talk about. But one of the primary drivers for that is that your glute med or your side butt doesn't pull its proportionate weight. Your glute max, the big muscle in your butt that helps you drive uphill and forward, might be doing fine from years of running, but your side butt might just be atrophied, or you might have poor connection. So regardless, it's just not really doing its job. If that's you, then you would benefit from something like sumo squats or sumo deadlifts because it forces you to keep your knee out. Yes, those little band hobble things like do a good job. I do them as a primer to get you in touch with that muscle if needed. But when we're really trying to build strength, you want both feet on the ground so you can drive and like build that part of your butt. So if, however, you have played a lot of lateral back and forth sports like soccer or basketball or ultimate frisbee in my case, then your glute med probably does a perfectly fine job. And you might not need that at all. And a sumo squat would, if anything, be reinforcing a movement pattern that you already have. So you're probably not going to see any real knee valgus on that person unless we have ankle stuff. Or if you do, again, it'll be ankle stuff. But if we do see that, like if we want to like get that conventional deadlift is what I'm trying to get to. You don't need a sumo deadlift because your side butt already does its job. So we'd want something more like a conventional deadlift or a kettlebell deadlift where your feet are more narrow so that we build the right muscles. This is just one example of why a movement assessment is helpful, not to mention some of the safety concerns. So you can do your own, and that's kind of what I want to show you here. It will require you to take video of yourself and assess it from a few different angles. It's kind of a pain, but you can absolutely do it. You could have someone do it for you. You could buy a training session or two with a personal trainer from a place where they sell like multiple or couple session packages, and they could give you some feedback as to how you move. There's many ways to do this. If you are going to do this yourself, you should absolutely video how you do. You trying to look in the mirror for some of these movements just isn't going to work very well. So set up your camera, try and get yourself from a bunch of different angles and go from there. Now you have to know what you're looking at, and there isn't enough time in the day, much less in the next 45 minutes that I'm probably going to be chattering on, for all the stuff you need to look for. So we're going to hit fundamentals. You build this over time. And this is what people often refer to as the coach's eye. And some people have been doing this longer than others. I am at the fairly decent advantage for mine that my dad was a physical therapist. So for me, literally as long as I can remember. So for like 30 years, we would be walking and he would point out the way people move. Like, oh, look at that person's foot. It caves in and they pronate. Or, oh, that's scoliosis or whatever. I am very used to looking at movement patterns. It's what my dad did for a living. He shared it with me. So instead of the 3 years that I've been training people, I've actually been assessing this for 30. So this is why you will often talk to a trainer. They have they have a good coach's eye, and you will see them point out stuff about your body that you didn't even recognize. And I'm not talking about where you carry your weight or anything like that. I just mean your basic movement patterns. I will often talk with people whose feet, when they walk, are not symmetrical. So if we're looking at them straight forward, they're both usually going to be a little turned out, and then one is often going to be more turned out than the other. And I had a person the other day, actually had this happen a few times, where their foot was turned out by an extra 15 degrees. So if we're looking at top, that's probably turned even more so. It was like this, and she had never noticed that. And it seems like a fairly glaring thing if you look at the person, but if you've never assessed that or don't know what you're looking for, it's just going to be overseen or overlooked.
Hey everyone, I've decided to stop doing ads for this podcast, at least for the time being. I just don't think they're a good use of anybody's time. So instead of that, I just have a simple ask. If you find this information valuable, please tell someone about it. Either hit the like or subscribe buttons on your preferred platform, share it with somebody, or you could even just head over to the Trail and Ultra Running Training Group on Facebook, and I'd appreciate that as well. I'm just trying to make more good, free information for people so we can all get better at running on the trails. And if we can spread the tribe, that would be great. Thank you, and let's get to the podcast.
Right, so you have to know what you're looking for and know how to identify the problems and then further what they mean. So for me, and for a lot of people, I start feet up. I much prefer to have people do movement assessments barefoot or in socks. It is not always something that someone's comfortable with, so we can do it in shoes. And I've gotten to the point where I can see how things happen if you're in shoes. But if you're barefoot, you'll get a better assessment. So if you're willing to do that for yourself, highly recommended. So let's look at a couple things. First, I almost always start off with some kind of squat assessment. Now, if you take a training course to become a personal trainer or whatever, they will usually have you do an overhead squat test where you put your arms like ramrod straight over your head, and then you drop into as deep of a squat as you realistically can, and then come back up. An overhead squat is incredibly difficult. It is an Olympic lift. I have never really had anybody who doesn't have a long training background drop directly into an overhead squat. So much so that I don't even find it useful anymore. My preferred version is to have someone take like a dowel or a PVC pipe or a broomstick and put it down their back, because we can see the same things with a lot less deviation and frustration. But I don't have one of those with me, so I'll show you both what we're looking for. Now, fair warning, if you were listening to this just on audio or podcast version, you should probably look at the video unless you have some training history and recognize what I'm talking about. Two, the sound is probably going to go in and out. I got a new mic recently, and it is much better from a sound quality perspective, but it doesn't pick up as well across the room. So you hear me get a little quieter and then a little louder. We'll see this shift. So from a squat perspective, let's see. You always want to be able to see the person's feet. So this is too close. If I have you squat like this, I can't see what your feet are doing, and I can barely see your knees. We want to be full height. I would actually much rather you cut off like your upper torso than your feet. And then I will typically have you put a dowel down your back or hold something overhead. And then we're going to squat to depth and come back up to top. See how deep you can get while maintaining good form. I usually have someone do like 3 to 5 facing me if I'm on video. If I'm in person, I will just do a 360 around the person as they do like 10 to 12. And then if we're on video, I'll be here, make sure I can see your feet again, tall, ideally dowel down the back, squat to depth, and then come back up to top. Now, things that I am really looking for from a deviation standpoint. First is your feet. How do they move? Do they stay pretty solid as you go down, or do they like to cave? So we can see this caving at the ankle. And if that's happening, there's a fairly decent chance that we don't have good foot strength or ankle stability. This can cause problems in your running. It is also likely to cause problems in your squat. So this will lead to some priming or strength stuff or warm-up things that will help you engage your foot better in a squat. So instead of having this collapsing, we will be able to engage the entire foot so that it stays as a stable base as you go through a squat. Next, we look at the knees. So if the deviation is not coming from the ankle, it's probably coming from the hip. So my feet are still strong, but this knee valgus is coming from my hip. And that is the kind of variation that would lead to me knowing whether you need like sumo deadlifts or sumo squats versus a more conventional variation, right? So that is the basics there. And then from an upper body, the reason we use the dowel is a lot of the time when people squat, we don't get this like nice flat back. We see either round, like much forward rounding, or a ton of extension and movement through the lumbar spine. If you have a dowel down your back, we're trying to keep it in contact with your head, that little occipital bone there, in between your shoulder blades and your hips. And if we deviate one way or the other, it gives me a good idea of what we might need to do to correct that. That's a squat. Then we will do a single leg squat, which never goes well. It's okay. It's a really difficult movement, but it does provide some stability information. So if we can get to full depth on a single leg squat, that's delightful. Very likely it's going to look more like this. And as we go down, I'm going to see your knee cave in like that. And a lot of shakiness. And what I really want to know here is not whether you can do a single leg squat. It's fairly irrelevant. If you can, you're already really strong. What I would like to know is whether there's a deviation side to side. So again, do your feet look about the same? Do you struggle more on one side than the other? If so, that will give us an idea of how we need to make adjustments for like split squat work versus a bilateral like heavy weighted squat. Once we get that, I will go into something usually called a windmill. So for a windmill, your feet are directly underneath your hips, and then we're going to stagger them by about a half of a foot's distance. So right now, my right foot is back from my left a little bit, and then I'm putting my right arm up into the air, and I'm going to take my left hand, I'm going to slide down my front shin, pushing my hips back, keeping the right arm up to the sky, and then slide back up to top. I usually have someone do that 3 or 4 times on one side, and then I'll have them face at a 90-degree angle as we do the exact same thing here and back up to top. Your knees are going to bend a little bit, but we really want this to come from hip motion. So things that we can see here are if you turn it into this, like, instead of being here, if it turns more into this squat, it's very likely that you don't have a lot of access to this hip hinge. That could be from tight hamstrings, it could be from tight glutes, it could just be not being used to the movement pattern. No matter what it is, it means that you're probably going to struggle a little bit with deadlifts and other hinge motions. So we want to make sure that those feel really solid so that you don't like hurt your back when you're doing a deadlift. You might need to start with the weight lifted a little bit off the ground. You might need a few things, but that is one of the main things I'm looking for, is whether you can even like create that hinge motion at your hips. So instead of a squat where the knees and the hips bend at the same time, whether we can like just focus on that hip bend, okay? Other things would be like how the upper body works here. So big deviations you'll see from this motion as we come down to the bottom, like the hand dips in one way or another. And if it dips from here, it's usually your upper back or rear of your shoulders, or you can see this entire like torso dip. That usually means we just don't have great connection to the obliques. And if we look, we can get further information on that if we slide here. If there's a nice neat line from my armpit down to my hip, it means my lats do a pretty good job. If they don't, then we end up with this like weird shoulder thing or like this strange curve. So just all looking at movement patterns and what it tells us from muscle perspective. Another thing that I like to have people do is a wall test. I do not have a great setup for this here. What this ends up being, so usually I will pop this to my phone and we'll move that direction past the curtain because I have a bare wall. I'm just going to have you stand up against a wall, your feet a little bit off the wall because everybody has a butt and we need to compensate for how far you are off the wall for like how big your butt is. For me, I have a big butt, so my feet are like 6 inches off the wall. Then I'm going to put my sacrum or my like low back in contact with the wall, and I'm going to put my arms up against the wall like this so that my elbows are at 90 degrees and I'm nice and tall. My head is going to be in light contact with the wall, my upper back, elbows, wrists, fingers, right? So we're not having any of this. We're here, nice and tall. Once we get to this position and everything is in contact from like upper back up to fingertips, then I try to have people tuck your pelvis. So from this position, if I were against a wall, everything from here up to my fingertips would be touching the wall, except for a very light bend in my neck for my cervical spine. If we can't get completely flush, then something is wrong, and we need to figure out what. If it is up here in your shoulder, could be a few things. It could be your rear delt or like infraspinatus. We just don't have that shoulder rotation. It could be your upper back. If your upper back is really rounded, what we call kyphotic, then we want to build strength there and get the chest to loosen up a little bit. And then what's most common is usually you'll have a little bit of deviation here, but not a ton. It typically presents as fingers and touch, elbows, but then wrists deviating off a little bit, like you're trying to avoid your watch on the wall. But what we'll often see is low back. So we'll get this nice and flush, everybody bows back like this. So we just don't have enough connection to our lower abdomen. So this will typically lead to reverse crunches or hollow holds or something along the lines there, so we can build a better connection to that like 8-pack structure, that rectus abdominis from top to bottom, where it connects from your pubis up to your sternum. Because we want to be able to like connect to that whole thing in order to create stability. Because if we can't create that bracing structure, what ends up happening is as you run and you get tired, we lose connection, and then we end up with that curved spine, and then everything ends up through this point in your low back. And that's one of the main reasons we can end up with low back pain while we run. It's because your abdomen just isn't, it's not that it's not strong enough, it's that like you don't have enough connection to it, or we're not strong enough in the right places, right? So this is one of the things we really care about as athletes, looking at a movement assessment on a wall test. Now, from there, we'll look at something called ankle flexion. And again, I don't have a great setup here. This is why I usually do this on the phone, but we need a like flat wall. So I'm going to move this so we can see. And then I'm going to set my foot up, tapping the bottom of the wall. I'm going to drive my knees over my toes until it touches the wall. It's a piece of glass. It looks like I'm shoving my knee directly into the heavenly realm, but it's just light. So then we're going to back up. I'm going to drive my knee forward. So my heel is still on the ground and my knee is still tapping the glass. So I'm going to keep doing this until my heel floats. That floated quite a bit. I'm going to move a little closer. There. So like right about here, my heel is just wanting to come up as my knee touches the wall. So I will take my hand sideways, put it down on the ground, and the distance from the wall to my hand was like, or the wall to my toe was a little wider than my hand if we compensate for the lip that's on the bottom of that door. So that is fine. I would love to have more. This is one of my big deficiencies. So I have worked on ankle mobility for years, and I've not made much more progress than that. To some degree, like you will have genetic limitations on your movement based on body structure and history and movement history and all sorts of stuff. So for me, ankle flexion is a struggle. It is one of the main reasons why I do not run well in like a 0-drop shoe, because no matter how much work I put into it, I only ever get like a little over 4 inches of ankle flexion. And as a result, if I'm in a 0-drop, I'm just driving through my calves constantly. If I have a little bit of drop, 6 millimeter, then I tend to not drive as much through my calf and I'm able to use my glutes. So this can lead to shoe recommendations for one. For another, it can tell us what's wrong with your squat. So if you have people, or if you yourself can only move like an inch off the ground before like heel starts to float, then you're really going to struggle to get into a deep squat. Because if we look at positioning here, as I squat, my knees like drive forward over my toes. We're at like 2 to 3 inches past my toes. And if I can't create that much flexion, then trying to get this like deep ass to grass squat, to use like layman's terms, is going to be pretty much impossible. So we would hit it from 2 directions. One, we'd probably lift your heel up a little bit, be it on like a 2.5 pound plate or something like that when you do squats, while also really prioritizing ankle flexion from a mobility standpoint. Because if we're running, you want to be able to create that like rear glute drive through your butt and not as much through your calf, because your butt's bigger than your calf. We want it to be able to work. So if you have no ankle flexion, you are constantly going to be doing this like toe running thing versus this actual posterior chain driven running from your butt. So if you have no ankle flexion, we want to make sure to improve that. The other big thing to note here is, and on all of these that are single-sided, is are you balanced from side to side? If one side is significantly worse or deficient or whatever from the other, then we want to try to correct that as much as we can. I would almost always rather see someone balanced than have a ton of mobility on one side and none in the other. And you'll see this a lot from all sorts of sports backgrounds. It's not just like genetic differences, like the extra rib that I mentioned earlier. If you ever meet or work with someone like a baseball pitcher, their right shoulder, if they were righty, their throwing arm is going to be ruined. Like it just messes them up. Versus like a water polo player is going to have problems in their hips. They almost always do, but it's usually pretty even side to side. There's usually a little deficiency or discrepancy rather, but not as much as like a baseball pitcher would be. So we want to try and balance that side to side is one of my biggest priorities when we look at programming. Another thing that works a lot better in person, but is not a big deal. So in person, I have a thing called a hurdle step where we like set someone up against the thing, and then we set up a hurdle at the height of their knee, like just below their kneecaps on their patellar tendon, and then I have them pick up, step over the hurdle, tap, come back, trying not to tap it's like a little rubber band. This tells me a bunch of stuff. One, shows me how stable you are. Two, it shows me how like your psoas and your like frontal hip flexors work. So being that nobody really has this hurdle in person, I just have them stand here, brace the torso, and then drive their knee up to their chest. And I'll have them do it sideways, and I want to see what that knee drive looks like and what their stability looks like. A lot of people who have only ever done like long endurance sports or grindy stuff without a ton of flexion here, you will see, maybe this is you, that your knee only really comes up to parallel. And if that's the case, you're going to struggle when it comes to like uphill and sprinting work. So we often hear about, if you look into training stuff, the psoas. And for a lot of people, it's tight. That is because we sit in this like seated posture all the time. But tight and weak often look the same. So if you've done a ton of endurance stuff and you're not always seated, it might just be weak. And we want to build that psoas so that we can get that knee drive. So that shows a little bit there and how your speed workouts are going to do. Now, a couple more basic ones. Pardon me as I lift this desk because I'm tired of hunching over. So another basic one that I try to have people do is called a shoulder impingement test. So stand here, touch your other shoulder with the opposite hand, and then try to bring your elbow up to your face and back down. This is just a pass-fail. Does it hurt or not? If it hurts, then we probably have some like shoulder impingement issues, and that is a very vague term. It is not particularly diagnostic or useful to figure out exactly what's going on, but it does tell me that if it hurts to do this, we should not be doing a ton of overhead pressing work, or else we're probably just going to foster a movement pattern that's going to hurt your shoulder. Now for me, my shoulder is separated, which is why this little nubbin is like really, really pronounced. And it's not as much on this side, much smoother. This sits like probably an inch lower on my left side than it does on my right. So I've done a lot of work to make that balanced, build a lot of muscle mass to keep it stable, but I can absolutely like create a shoulder impingement immediately. So if we sit like I normally am, packed down my back, have all my muscles engaged, it doesn't hurt at all, it's totally fine. If we go to this like basic resting position where it sits a little forward, it hurts pretty excruciatingly right about there. So again, these things are reparable. You just have to know what to do and what the cause is. And then finally, the last piece of assessment I do for people is, I forgot this one while the desk was down, so pardon me as we do this one more time, is a single leg deadlift. So I love a single leg deadlift. I think it's super helpful. I think most people cannot do one, and that's no judgment. It takes a lot of practice. It's a very skill-based movement. So I want to see, one, how good you are at it, to see if we can include it in your program from the get-go. And then two, it gives me a basic assessment of how your hips move. So every time you walk, be it walking or running, your femur like rotates around in what's called your acetabulum or your hip socket. So when you step forward, your hips shift this way to allow your leg to come forward, and then you shift weight so it moves inwards. You drag your leg through, moving inwards even more as we step, and then come back to flat. So your femur is constantly doing this like back and forth, lateral and up and down motion as we go through this walk. If it can't do that, we end up with two compensations. So instead of walking really smoothly, if we don't have the lateral access, you will often see people like kind of sway side to side, almost like a duck waddle. And then if we lose even like that forward motion, and you'll see this typically in the elderly who haven't done any training, it almost becomes like this shuffle where they really can't move their femur and their hip socket at all. These are clearly large problems if you want to run, but even a like smaller degree of this can cause problems down the line. We really want to have a full access to the rotation in your hip socket. It is one of the most mobile joints in your body, and you take thousands of steps every time you go out for a run. So even small movement problems here can lead to big compensations and pain down the line. So a great way to assess this, that you don't need to know a ton of stuff, is a single leg deadlift. I'm going to be here. This is my working leg. It's my left. I'm going to bend the knee in that leg a little bit, and then I'm going to hinge forward at the hips, reaching down, and then I'm going to come back up to top. As I reach back with that, my right heel, I'm shifting my weight back into my left leg, keeping my torso stable, and coming back to top. What is probably going to happen, if you've never done this before, is you're going to like externally rotate your hips. So instead of my right toes staying pointed to the ground like they are here, and we can try to go lower, it doesn't really matter. I want you to have access over the range of motion. Hell, for running, it could be as low as this and we can still get some assessments, right? It doesn't need to be this like beautiful gymnastic movement. So clearly I don't have the stability to go that low. So as we shift back, your toes should stay pointed to the ground instead of flaring up here. If we start to flare up here, it means that your hip doesn't have access to this internal rotation, or you can't control it. Either way, we want to build that control so that you can do this movement better. I see this problem in most people, if we're being honest. So unless you've done a ton of these, we will typically see as you come back, rather than keeping the pelvis flat, it flares to some version of this, almost like this yoga half moon pose. And as we come down, it's the wrong pants for this, we also don't want to see that stability created through the knee. So if your hip flares, your knee can still move enough to compensate. So you want the knee to be in line with the foot as we keep that stable hip. So depending on what you find there, we might need to make some adjustments. The two biggest ones are when you don't have access to that lateral hip. The way we work on that, I prefer called a supported hip airplane. So grab onto something for balance and have you reach down, keep the pelvis flat, and then we're going to use the hip to open, use the hip to completely close, and then back up to top. So again, I probably have about one of these in me without a support. This shouldn't be a balance exercise. We're trying to get control. So hold on to a stick or a broom or something, but reach back, keep the pelvis flat, stack, under control, trying to keep it open, pull back down, then close even further, and then back up and stand. Really slow and controlled. If we're doing it like that, it's not really doing much. We really want to make every like micro movement of that as controlled as possible. The other thing that goes wrong in a single leg deadlift comes back to that like inability to hinge that we discussed when we were looking at a windmill. If your shin, as you come down, tends to go forward, it means we probably don't have a ton of access to that hip hinge motion. And instead you're throwing everything into your quad. So as we reach down, we want to keep that shin fairly vertical. Can have a little bit of forward bend, but for the most part, my tibia is like 5 degrees off normal, right? So if that's the case where we can't keep you backwards, then I'm going to prescribe something like a front foot elevated split squat because it forces you to keep your shin vertical as you go in an up and down motion. So I know that was a lot, kind of the point. If you do this for a long time, we can knock that out in like 20 minutes and you see a lot of these things, and then you use that to create strength programming. And this is kind of what goes into behind the scenes. I think a lot of the time programming for individuals is a little over mysterious. It's really not. It's just knowing what to look for and then being able to do it quickly so it doesn't take you all day. So again, we do the squat. I like a dowel down the back, but you can absolutely do the overhead version. If we do the overhead version, you're going to see typically like arms dipping forward rather than being able to stay up by the ears. For me, I often it's tough to know where that's coming from, and we just answer that later. So I prefer a dowel down the back to see how your knees move and how your feet move. We'll do a single leg squat to look at your stability. We'll do a windmill to see if you have access to a hip hinge, how tight your hamstrings are, whether your obliques and your lats work. We'll do a wall test to see if you can create rotation in your shoulder, how strong your upper back is, and whether you have access to your lower abdomen. We'll do an ankle flexion test to see if you have enough ankle flexion to squat appropriately or run on flat ground without ending up in your calves. I'll often do a hurdle. This is one of those that kind of depends on the person. I'll often do a hurdle to see if you have access to your psoas, and then shoulder impingement to see if pressing overhead is safe for you, and then a single leg deadlift to see how your hips move. If we do all of that, great, we have a pretty good idea. And then if we're in person or through talking to someone over the coming weeks, we can adjust as needed. Because if I'm in person with somebody, every session is an assessment. Yes, you're doing deadlifts, but I'm also looking at your knees and ankles and seeing how you move. It never really stops. And then from a online perspective, this is why people ask me questions. We do this constant thing, or I'll have pop on a Zoom really quick with somebody and see how they're moving to make sure that nothing is really causing problems, because things will adjust as you get stronger or as you get more control. Your movement patterns will change. It's one of the reasons that we do strength training in the first place, to adjust movement patterns to fit what you need to do. So we need to reassess occasionally and kind of see where you are. And some of that reassessment can just come from how well these movements are going for you. And then some of it needs to be all right, let's actually sit down and do this again. And one of the big things too is that the problem is not always where the pain or where the struggle is. So if we look at a couple examples, one, high hamstring tendinopathy. High hamstring tendinopathy is usually pain right here where your hamstring inserts into your butt, typically on your intermedial hamstring. And that often comes from when you're running, your knee caves a little bit. And that makes your inner hamstring longer than it needs to be. So it puts stress on that tendon. So eventually it just ends up with micro tears and then problems and standard tendinopathy. And if we end up in that place, the fix is not necessarily the hamstring. It is often the glute med and trying to build that side butt, because again, if we're seeing that knee valgus from a hip perspective, it is often from there. It can also be from your feet. Overpronating feet where your feet collapse are not a bad in and of themselves, but if you overpronate to a degree that everything caves in and you can't create control, that's where we start to see movement compensations and pain. So even though the pain is in your hamstring, and putting that under some kind of load and repair is a good idea through Romanian deadlifts or whatever, it is even better to fix the problem at the root, whether it be your feet or your glute med. Another example is I have a client right now who has shoulder stuff. We don't need to completely dive into what his problems are with his shoulder, but he feels a lot of pain and tightness in his tricep. It's not his tricep. It is where this shoulder muscle here, this is called your infraspinatus. It is one of the four muscles of your rotator cuff, and it inserts here on your tricep, and deviate a little bit depending on the person. And he's feeling pain here, so he's been trying to get his tricep to stretch and lengthen, when what's actually going on is his teres major here is too tight. It's pulling him down. Sorry, that's the one that we're struggling with. And then his infraspinatus is too weak and it's not doing the job. So we've actually been trying to get this muscle looser down his back, and then we're trying to get the other muscle stronger. So even though the pain feels like it's in his tricep, it's actually in his shoulder and upper back. So understanding where the pain comes from is how we fix the problem. It doesn't actually necessarily have to do with the thing that you're feeling. So I hope that was helpful. I'm putting out a new strength guide that I've been threatening for weeks. Sorry, it's been a very long race season with multiple people racing over the past few weeks, but finally had a short pause, and I'm going to release that this week. This video will be linked to it so that you can always assess yourself as needed. So I hope that was helpful. Keep an eye out for the strength guide. If you have any questions on strength or want to do a free consult, that's why I do consults for free, please message me. Either text, my number is everywhere, or just hit an application fee on the internet or at the end of the strength guide. I would love to talk to you and help you do this assessment so that you strength train well. That is the whole goal, to help you out. So if you're struggling and want better strength work, shoot me a message. I'll help you set that up. If this is enough for you, happy day. Go do the thing. Anyway, I'm going to head out, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you for listening to the Trail and Ultra Running Training Podcast. Honestly, I'm still surprised and honored that anybody wants to hear what I have to say, so thank you. To be clear, not a doctor, nor a registered dietitian, or any other kind of medical professional. I'm a personal trainer, a nutrition coach, and a running coach, and I have a passion for training trail runners. You should always speak with a qualified medical professional before making any changes to your training or nutrition program. If you enjoyed the podcast or found it helpful, please take a second to leave a rating or review. I'd really appreciate it. Or you could just share it with someone for whom you think it might be helpful. I make these kinds of things in order to provide more quality, free resources to people, so the more people who hear it, the better. If you want more of this information, please head to the Trail and Ultra Running Training group on Facebook, where we discuss all aspects of training so you can have more fun doing the sport that you love. Thank you again for listening.